Hello, this is Nick from NAH Guitars, and like any good guitar maker, I've been giving a lot of thought recently to my nuts. If you want to find out whether a guitar maker is good, then I recommend having a good look at their nuts. I like to see that nuts are a good size, that they're nice and smooth, and they're very well presented. And of course, I'd like to make sure that my nuts are as well presented as possible, so that my customers are fully satisfied. So I've been thinking recently about how I can improve my nuts. And in this video, I thought it would be interesting to see whether or not I could make a device that will make my nuts better. I would like to start by saying this is a very serious topic, so if anybody out there is smirking or laughing, you should stop straight away. Rarely a day goes by without something popping into my inbox from a large American luthier company, suggesting another tool for me to get my hands on. Quite often I look at these tools with some envy, but in the UK, if you import something from America, it ends up being very expensive. One of the things that I've spotted is a nut slotting gauge, and I thought, having looked at it, that it looked very simple. It appears to be just a dial indicator and a brass block, and I thought, well, maybe I could try and make one of those. I could buy a dial indicator from Amazon, and you can buy them for somewhere between £15 and £25. And I also wondered whether I could print, using my 3D printer, some sort of block that I could use instead of brass. So what I'm going to show you now is my attempt at having a go at making one of these nut slotting gauges. I ordered this dial indicator, a digital version, through Amazon. I think it was maybe just under £20, £19.99, something like that. And it looks really nice. But I realised straight away that it probably wouldn't work. So anyway, let's just run through it and see why. So we have our on-off, and we can measure either in inches or millimeters, and when this plunger moves up and down, then it measures the distance that the tip of the plunger has moved. And you've got a 0 function, so you can press 0 and start again, like that. So it looks pretty good, except I could tell straight away that it wouldn't work. And there are two things that are problematic. So the first one is that the resistance of the plunger is really high. And the way this is supposed to work is that you're supposed to put it onto the string, and the device should be under some tension. And then you put your fingers either side of the string, push the string down, and there should be a small deflection, and you can measure that deflection. And the problem with this is that the spring on the plunger is so strong that as soon as this is pushed down onto the string, then it will simply deflect the string, push it against the fret, and there'll be nothing to measure. So the other problem is that the tip of the plunger is smooth, and that will just push off the string. So something needs to be done about that. The other thing that I realised, which probably wasn't in my favour, was that you can get dial indicators with different degrees of travel. And this one travels 1 inch, approximately 1 inch, or 25.4 millimeters, just over in fact. But you can get some that are maybe half the travel. And I probably would have been better buying one with a shorter travel. And I was thinking that perhaps the spring or the resistance against this push would be less with shorter travel. I wasn't deterred, and I printed out a small block with my 3D printer. And you can see, I haven't actually used this one. It's printed with various supports on the inside that have to be removed. But anyway, this was my first attempt, and some things that were obviously wrong. Actually, I probably can't show you this, but once this is in, then the plunger's too long. So it would have been better to buy one with a shorter plunger. But even so, it was not going to work. What I then did was I printed out a slightly larger one, which is perhaps practically not so good. Has some advantages. It's a little bit heavier. It's not as heavy as brass, but nevertheless, it's a little heavier than the original small one. And the advantage of this is that being longer, I can push this in and I'll be able to lock it in place, and just the tip of this will be protruding. If I'd put it in this smaller one, then this would have to be pushed in all the way, and the tension is really high because this is obviously being pushed against a spring. And so the further you push it in, the higher the tension, so the less likely it's going to be any use whatsoever. So this was my first idea, to make a slightly longer base, and then I would just be using the very tip of the travel, and maybe the resistance wouldn't be too high. But unfortunately, when you put it onto the fretboard, the spring is too strong, and the tip of the plunger just pushes the string down. So the other problem I had was, because the plunger has got a nice shiny end, I had to do something about that. So I printed out a little cap, and that cap can just be pushed over, so that now we have a nice flat surface to put onto our string. And when this is pushed into there, we can have something like this. I don't know whether you can see it, but if it's pushed up against something, it's meant to work like that. Basically, if you buy one of these things, and I imagine even if it's with a shorter distance of travel, this is not going to work out of the box. But anyway, I was inquisitive, so I had a look inside, and I've taken the back off already, but we can have a look inside. And what you can see is the mechanism is very straightforward. I have no idea how the electronics work, but there is a spring inside, and you can see it. And so immediately I thought, well, great, I'll just take the spring off. The spring comes off very easily, or relatively easily, he said. If I can find something to take it off with. Okay, now I've already modified this, so I'll pretend that I haven't modified it. But the problem is the same. The problem is that the plunger, even though there is no spring on it, the plunger is too heavy. And so even the weight of the plunger itself is too heavy, and when you put it onto the string, it depresses the string against the first fret, and it doesn't allow you to depress this anymore. I thought about starting to chop this bar up, make it smaller, lose some weight. I tried taking off the cap at the top, which unscrews, just to reduce the weight, but unfortunately that doesn't work. But what does work is putting a spring on this section between this bit of the block and the bottom. Now this is just a homemade spring that I made out of an E string, a high E string from a guitar. Just wanted some metal that would stay in place when I bent it. And I haven't really done a good job. It's not the world's best spring, but it works. And what you find is that if you hold this up vertically, then you find a point where there is almost no resistance against this. And if you put this into this device here, then you can just find the point where you can pop this onto the guitar. You can zero it. I'm not sure I can show you this very well. You can put it onto the guitar like this. Imagine there's a spring in there. You can zero it, and a small deflection, one way or another, will be registered. What would be even better would be to find a proper spring, because this is a little bit Heath Robinson, and it's probably going to break or move and not be reliable or reproducible. But I have done some tests with it, and it seems to work. So in principle it works, but it'll work much better and much more reliably with a proper spring of the right size. It has to be a very light spring, but it just needs to be one that allows the plunger to sit midway with almost no tension or force on it at all, so that it will just bounce up and down with very little friction or force, and it works. So here we have a thin line Telecaster style guitar that I made, and this needs the strings changing, and I thought we could just use this to see whether or not the gauge does its job. And let's see how accurate it is compared to feeler gauges. So we have to position the device on the guitar. Trying to do this without getting in the way. Press 0, push down the string, and that says 16 thousandths. Just try it again. 16 thousandths. A string. Maybe 16 and a half thousandths. 16 and a half. Okay, next one. So the D string is about 13 and a half thousandths. Oh, just it's moving a bit. Twelve and a half. To get to the top three strings, I've got to turn that around. So say 16 thousandths. Yep, 16 thousandths. That's the G string, B string, okay, 13 thousandths, and finally the high E string. Okay, so the high E string is coming out at about 16. Yeah, about 16. Okay, so I struggled a little bit because I'm trying to do this while reaching around the camera. But let's just see whether or not those seem to fit with the feeler gauge. All right, so the feeler gauge, I'll start with 17. Pop that under the first fret. It's very close. So the A string is probably just under 17, just squeaking under. The D string is less than that. So let's try. Let's go with a 15. So the D string is just about 15, possibly 14. The G string is slightly higher than 15. Let's go from the other side. B string is about 15, maybe slightly less than 15, and the E is is higher than 15, probably 16, I would think. Yeah, about 16. So, I would say that this measuring device is giving us values that are pretty much identical to the values on the feeler gauges. So I would say that this is working. But there's a few things that I need to do to improve it. First one is I'll get a decent spring, which will make this much more reproducible. Second thing is I've got to get a bolt that I can, a tapped bolt that I can put in to make sure that the dial indicator is secured firmly into this base plate. And I think it would be better to have a base plate made out of brass because the additional weight is really quite useful. The other thing that would be worth thinking about would be perhaps putting some radius on the bottom of the block. I mean, that's a little difficult because each guitar fretboard has a different radius, or could have a different radius. So it may be that flat is better. But I did notice that in some places it was a little difficult to hold this completely steady because it had a tendency to rock. And it would be nice to try and figure out why that is and how to get rid of it. But provided this is held firmly in place, then it seems to work well. Okay, so what have we learned from this video? Well, I think we've learned that it is possible to make a nut gauge indicator at home. You need to modify the dial indicator by adding a spring, a compression spring, and you need to have some sort of bass. And a heavy bass is better than a light bass, but a light bass like this one does work. It's just a little bit difficult to hold. So I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much for watching. And if you would like to improve your nuts, then I suggest you go out and make yourself a nut gauge indicator.